I'm sitting here now with two very experienced people in the field of sustainability. It's Susanne Stormer, Vice President of Corporate Sustainability at Novo Nordisk, and Georg Kell, who used to work for the United Nations and is actually the founder of UN Global Compact, and now Chairman of the Board at Arabesque. Welcome.
Thank you.
It was almost 20 years ago when you actually came up with the idea of the UN Global Compact, which is like a framework for companies to work with the sustainability issues. And when you look back at this and where we are today, did it develop according to your plan, or did something surprise you?
Total surprise, unpredictable. I think stepping back now, I could say a silent revolution has started. Bridging public interests with corporate interests and identifying strategic overlaps, operational synergies. I think it's a small miracle. Many initiatives in the meantime are all over the world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, Europe, North America, that recognize that corporates as part of society increasingly also consider what's happening around them, and they find ways to integrate this into their own strategic mindset, into their operations. So I would say a small miracle in a positive way, a silent revolution.
And when it comes to investors, do you think we have reached a tipping point where ESG investing is not only a niche strategy, but actually becomes mainstream?
I think it's happening right now. Finance has been lagging behind in this historic evolution. Finance was very short-term always. It didn't have the tools. It had the perception that sustainable investing is at the expense of returns. Then there were also misperceptions about fiduciary responsibilities, considering extra financial information, environmental, social governance, not as part of the duty of directors sitting on pension fund boards and the likes. This has all changed now. I think the big breakthrough started to happen 2 years ago when for the first time it was possible to bring the empirical evidence that in a portfolio concept, at least, when you have big numbers of companies together, there is a clear and very strong positive correlation between good environmental, social governance performance on the one hand, especially with a material focus, and financial performance on the other. Many have helped make this happen. One is obviously the disclosure movement, Global Reporting Initiative, CDP, and many others, producing enormous amount of data, but also stock exchanging, acting as catalysts, in particular NASDAQ. I really have to praise NASDAQ, because a few years ago, NASDAQ has helped to turn the tide within the World Federation of Exchanges. Today, more than 60 exchanges worldwide are issuing guidance on ESG disclosure. Some even make it mandatory in the listings. Many produce innovative products that expand that space. So many infrastructural components, data revolution. Behind it, I believe personally, it's technology which has been driving this on the transparency side, on the disclosure side, and also enabling now to make this connection work. So I do believe we are at a tipping point where convergence between sustainable investing that is informed through deep ESG integration on the one hand, with corporate responsibility on the other, where the two meet together, and actually by relocating capital towards more responsible, sustainable companies, investors now have a chance to actually be part of the solution, transforming markets towards cleaner, more inclusive economies. Yes, I think that is within grasp now.
And you, Susanne, Novo Nordisk was very early to adopt ESG strategies. I don't know if actually the term ESG was invented by then, but corporate social responsibility and so on. How did it all start, and how among these different angles of sustainability, how do you actually apply them to your company?
It surely wasn't invented when we started working with it, because Novo Nordisk was founded in 1923 on a vision to help people with diabetes to live better lives. At that time, it was a very rare disease, and it was a promise to these people that we would do whatever we could through the medicine we developed. So you can say the purpose-driven and the values-based approach to business has been there through all the history since 1923. But you're right, we started working systematically with environmental management in the mid-70s, and that was early on. And it was against a backdrop of being challenged by NGOs. And I think you see a pattern for many companies that the ones who have been in the firing line, where they've been challenged on their business practices, they have learned to address some of these issues. So environment was one of the first movers. Then we conducted a human rights assessment in the mid-90s, where we identified some areas like access to care, equal opportunities in the workplace, responsibility in the supply chain, and also integrity and privacy in terms of data. So we will recognize many of these issues as elements of the UN Global Compact principles that were formed back in 2002. And I think it's important to mention here that for Novo Nordisk, and I think for many other companies, to be conducting your business in a responsible way has to be the foundation, because without that, you won't have that license to operate and to be in business, that trust by your stakeholders. But it takes more these days. So it also takes an ability for the company to document how you add value in society. So that's the shared value thinking, how you can contribute in the case of Novo Nordisk, how you provide better quality of care, improve the lives of the patients that we serve. And then on top of that, companies are also increasingly expected to address the global issues. So this is where we have the Sustainable Development Goals and the inclusion of business. So this revolution that we talked about is also one that moves companies up the ladder. And fundamentally, what you need to ensure is that that base level of the ladder to be able to demonstrate responsible business practices is where ESG sits, and where ESG guidelines, such as the ones that NASDAQ has developed, are extremely useful for companies that need to get their heads around this, to understand, so what does it mean and how do we work with it to really make it operational?
What are the profits for the companies? Are also investors interested in these themes?
Yes, I think the argument is, well, it might be costly to do, but it would, I would argue, it would be much more costly not to. So there you are carrying a risk, which would be ultimately undermining your business. And it's hard to put numbers to it, but clearly what we can see is you can create a virtuous circle where if you have a clear purpose, you can account for your performance, then you can increase the credibility of the company, which drives customer loyalty, employee retention, employee engagement. It drives innovation, and ultimately it will also enhance your financial performance. The question, of course, is that $64,000 question: what is the causality for the financial performance? Because we can point to correlations, and in our case, we would argue it doesn't really matter, because for us, it is the right way of doing business. And we firmly believe that it is part of the strong financial results that we've had invariably over decades.
Yeah, I want to build on that, Susanne, and two comments. First, I think the Nordic world in particular has been extremely well prepared for the globalization of these issues, which started in the late 90s, because that kind of mindset, is not self-evident everywhere. Many corporates around the world, Asia, Latin America, struggling with corruption, struggling with social issues, inclusion, gender issues, and so forth. So there's in the marketplaces there are different values merging together. So to bring out the consensus-based stakeholder notion has been very important. So I can say also with some pride, so to speak, that the Nordic world has been extremely important in shaping that framework in a certain way. And that was also one reason why Nordic companies joined global platforms very early on, because they understood the importance of maintaining their business models on a global scale. And secondly, I also have seen so many companies who learned through crisis situations how to rediscover purpose and openness and stakeholder engagement, and how to be proactive on these issues. And the costs of getting it wrong are always understood when crisis hits. Then all corporations understand the steep price tag they have to pay for mistakes made, for not paying attention. But it has been extremely difficult to communicate convincingly to CEOs the benefits of getting it right before crisis hits. And that is changing now through ESG integration, because through this strong correlation, you can really appeal to board-level executives that, look, if you want to create value over the long run, then actually this is the one pathway of going forward. And this is where this convergence now of data, information on the one hand, and the ability to have sufficient strong evidence. I call it sometimes correlation plus, because it's actually more than a correlation now. One can already, in the search for alpha, you can log, when you switch off some parameters and data, you can clearly prove which ESG dimension contributes to outperformance. And that is totally new in the world of finance. It's thanks to big data. And our own firm now has a track record of 3 years life history, and we have outperformed MSCI comparable indices significantly, despite crisis situations such as the Trump effect, so to speak, where some assets went up where a long-term value creator would say they shouldn't go up. And then there were other crisis situations like the China bubble about to burst and not to burst, when trends went up and down. The point really here is, I think, that on the technology side, despite the fact that data information is still fractured, incomplete, and clearly there are huge gaps still around the world, in some parts it's very hard to get data on information. Already with the existing fragmented data, you can unlock information that is important. And since technology is irreversible, since the planetary boundaries increasingly put a premium on proactive, innovative leadership, and since on the governance side we increasingly have personal preferences playing a role in investment decisions and in personal lifestyle decisions, it is very clear that this convergence now is very much in the making, where good corporate performance is recognized, is supported, enjoys lower capital cost, enjoys greater valuation. Keep in mind, 80% of corporate valuation, by and large, is intangibles. And what does that mean? The intangibles are clearly influenced by ESG practices, perceptions, and realities. So the financial relevance of traditionally non-financial information is of fundamental and of growing importance. And thanks to technology and data, I believe it is now possible to bring these two together. And as was said earlier in the conference, what NASDAQ is planning to do here, I really hope with big success. I believe breakthroughs are now possible to genuinely put markets on a more sustainable footing.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that shareholder value is now being redefined to not only the financial value, so to speak, but that you also want to invest in something that is helping our planet or feeling meaningful and Is that also
Yes.
a trend?
Yes, even in the US there are some phenomenal breakthroughs, both at the conceptual, at the theoretical level. Great article coming out from Lynn, for example, Harvard Business Review just recently, reinterpreting Milton Friedman's statements in a modern setting. Clearly, we have moved into a stakeholder capitalism where long-term value generation is not defined by short-term ability to outsmart everybody in every corner, but to be proactive, to build long-term assets, trust-based, and above all, then obviously also with technology to give the stewardship. So we're moving into a different understanding what success over time means. And this new dominant understanding is now influencing investors. And we heard about this great study that State Street put out just recently, very important, because traditionally the world of finance claimed there's a fiduciary duty not to look into ESG, which is of course madness. Now the opposite is happening. Investors not looking into the risk aspect of climate change. Actually, can you really trust those guys? No, you can't. Of course you want to have information on climate risks. Secondly, information and tool availability. True, 3 years ago it was next to impossible for mainstream analysts to apply lenses across industries in a halfway credible manner to better assess ESG performance. Those tools are now available on the marketplace. Major breakthrough, makes it for analysts who grew up with a min-max mindset and have no understanding of the world, history or geography, to be able to put a lens on that. That has been broken down. And thirdly, and that is where we live in right now in this world, we cannot predict the future, obviously, but we have to anticipate major changes that are induced, caused, related to extra financial trends we can name already, and we know what they are. You mentioned in the health trend some of these issues. It's very obvious. On the environmental front, it's very obvious. On the governance, social front, it's very obvious. So this fluidity leads to a new understanding of long-term success. And not only 5 years down the road, but even by next year maybe already.
But I want to build also on a point that Georg made, is any business leader would want to see his business be sustained. So in the case of Novo Nordisk, we are pushing towards 100 years, and we would anticipate that we could be around for another 100 years. But in order to do so, to be a sustainable business, you need to factor in these dimensions. So actually we choose, rather than call it non-financial, because it does give a kind of hierarchy, we call it pre-financial factors, because they are predictors of future performance. And so my argument would be that regardless of the size of your business, if you do scan the horizon and look at these factors, it is essentially good governance, it's good management, that you are able to effectively respond to changing expectations from stakeholders and changing dynamics in society. So that's the way I would like to look at the ESG.
I would totally agree with what Susanne said, and just add that if you then consider that indeed there are some big mega trends here around us which are here to stay, then the conclusions are pretty clear and obvious, and it's very obvious that this agenda is not only here to stay, but it's bound to grow, and this convergence of finance and business is now genuinely within grasp.
Thank you very much, Susanne and Georg, and I wish you an interesting day here at Nasdaq.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.